Police officer Mohammed Noor behind bars, the maximum penalty possible for fatally shooting a 911 caller.
In a world where the line between law and lawlessness blurs, imagine a scenario where those sworn to protect the public become the very criminals they once pursued. Corrupt cops, entangled in webs of deceit, bribery, and betrayal, find themselves behind bars, stripped of their badges and authority. As they navigate the harsh realities of prison life, how will they survive sharing the same cells with the very criminals they once arrested? Get ready to be fascinated on how corrupt cops are treated in prison. Mohammed Noor. It's a balmy summer night in Minneapolis on July 15, 2017. Justine, a lively 40-year-old yoga instructor, was at home enjoying the peacefulness of her neighborhood. Suddenly, she hears something alarming, a possible assault happening in the alley behind her house. Now, most of us would probably do the same thing in that situation. She picks up the phone and dials 911, hoping to bring help to someone in distress. But here's where things took a tragic turn. Justine, with her heart in the right place, steps outside to flag down the police officers when they arrive. She's just trying to help, right? But in a shocking twist of fate, a police officer named Mohammed Noor, who was in the passenger seat of the squad car, fires his weapon, striking Justine in the abdomen. In a matter of moments, a call for help turned into a nightmare, and Justine's life was cut short. Now, let's take a moment to talk about Mohammed Noor. He was born in Somalia and moved to the United States in 1990. Noor made history as one of the first Somali-American police officers in Minneapolis. He joined the force with dreams of bridging gaps between law enforcement and the community, driven by a desire to make a positive impact. But that night, everything changed. Noor had been on the job for just a couple of years, and while he had aspirations of being a community-oriented officer, the circumstances of that evening put him in the spotlight. When news broke about Justine's death, it sent shockwaves through the community. People were outraged. How could this happen? A woman calling for help had become a victim of the very system meant to protect her. Justine's death raised serious questions about police conduct and accountability. However, in the days following the shooting, Noor was charged with third-degree murder and second-degree manslaughter. This was a big deal. Very few police officers face criminal charges for on-duty shootings. The case quickly became a hot topic, stirring up discussions about race, policing, and the need for reform. In April 2019, the trial of Mohammed Noor began, and everyone wanted to know how this would unfold. The prosecution wasted no time, arguing that Noor acted with a reckless disregard for human life. They painted a picture of a chaotic scene where a trained officer failed to uphold his duty. But Noor's defense had a different story to tell. He took the stand, describing the moments leading up to the shooting. He claimed he saw a figure approaching the car and heard a loud noise, which made him feel threatened. In his mind, he was acting in self-defense. The jury was left to sift through these conflicting narratives. Was this a tragic mistake or a reckless act of violence? After weeks of testimony, the jury finally reached a verdict. On April 30th, 2019, Mohammed Noor was found guilty of third-degree murder and second-degree manslaughter. He was acquitted of the more serious charge of second-degree intentional murder. Reactions were mixed. Some felt justice had been served, while others believed it was not enough given the loss of life. On June 2019, Noor was sentenced to 12.5 years in prison. The sentence sparked further debate. Many in the community felt it was a step toward accountability, while others believed it didn't go far enough. Justine's family had a settlement of $20 million with the city of Minneapolis, highlighting the profound impact of her death. But wait, there's more to this story. On September 2021, the Minnesota Supreme Court made a surprising move and overturned Noor's third-degree murder conviction. They ruled that the charge didn't fit the circumstances. Talk about a twist. This ruling left many feeling frustrated and confused, raising questions about the legal definitions of murder and the accountability of police officers. On October 2021, Noor was sentenced to nearly 5 years for second-degree manslaughter, the maximum allowed under state guidelines. This new sentence was significantly less than his original term, reigniting protests and calls for justice from Justine's family and supporters who felt the system had once again let them down. So, what does all this mean? The case of Mohamed Noor and Justine Damond became a focal point for discussions about police reform and accountability. Activists and community leaders rallied together, demanding greater transparency and oversight of police practices. The incident raised important questions about how we view policing, especially in communities of color. Noor's identity as a Somali-American officer added another layer to the narrative. The case highlighted the challenges faced by officers of color and sparked important discussions about race and policing. Mohamed Noor began serving his sentence at Minnesota Correctional Facility in Oak Park Heights, which has a maximum security prison. Mohamed Noor was transferred to another prison primarily for safety reasons. After initially being held in administrative segregation due to his status as a former police officer, he was later moved to a North Dakota facility. This transfer aimed to ensure his protection, as former law enforcement personnel can be at higher risk in the general prison population. However, in July 2019, he was transferred to a North Dakota facility for safety concerns because of his high-profile case. It was aimed at protecting him from potential threats from other inmates. Michael Slager. It was a seemingly routine traffic stop that turned into a tragic confrontation. On the morning of April 4th, 2015, in the parking lot of an auto parts store in North Charleston, South Carolina, 33-year-old officer Michael Slager pulled over Walter Scott for a non-functioning brake light. Sounds pretty standard, right? Just another day on the job. But things took a dramatic turn when Scott, perhaps fearing arrest for unpaid child support, decided to flee on foot. Little did they know, this chance encounter would soon spiral into a nightmare. Scott, a 50-year-old forklift operator, was driving his 1999 Mercedes to the store when Slager approached his vehicle. The dashcam footage showed Slager speaking with Scott and then returning to his patrol car. But in a split second, Scott made a fateful decision. He bolted from his car and took off running. The two men ran into a nearby lot behind a pawn shop, where a physical altercation ensued. Soon, what was supposed to be an investigation became a struggle. During the struggle, Slager fired his taser, striking Scott, but Scott managed to break free and kept running. What a fight for survival. With no warning, Slager drew his .45 caliber Glock 21 handgun and opened fire. 8 shots rang out as Scott fled, his back turned to the officer. The coroner's report later revealed that Scott had been struck 5 times, 3 in the back, once in the upper buttocks, and once in the ear. A forensic pathologist testified that the fatal wound entered Scott's back, piercing his lungs and heart, which led to his death. Slager immediately radioed for backup, claiming that Scott had taken his taser and that he had feared for his life. But the narrative shifted when a bystander Fiden Santana's video surfaced, showing Scott running away as Slager fired the fatal shots. The footage contradicted Slager's initial report, sparking outrage across the nation. As the investigation unfolded, more details emerged. A toxicology report showed that Scott had cocaine and alcohol in his system, though the levels were relatively low. A passenger in Scott's car, believed to be a coworker and friend, was briefly detained by police for further interrogation about that. After the shooting, Slager was fired from the police department and charged with murder. His trial began in late 2016, but ended in a mistrial when the jury couldn't reach a unanimous verdict. It's almost like a bad movie where the villain keeps getting away with it. But the story didn't end there. In May 2017, Slager pleaded guilty to federal civil rights charges, which meant he was admitting to violating Scott's rights under the color of law. In December 2017, he was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. Now, you might be wondering, what's it like for a former cop to be behind bars? Well, let's just say it's not like a scene from Cops. Once Slager entered the prison system, he found himself in a world that was starkly different from the one he had patrolled as an officer. First off, he wasn't exactly the most popular guy on the block. You see, being a former police officer in prison can be a bit like being a vegan at a barbecue. Everyone's eyeing you suspiciously, and it's hard to find common ground. Initially, Slager was placed in solitary confinement for his safety. This is a common practice for former law enforcement officers, as they can become targets for violence from other inmates. Imagine being in a small cell, alone with your thoughts, and realizing that your choices have led you to this moment. It's a heavy burden to bear. While in solitary, Slager found himself in a cell block next to none other than Dylan Roof, the man convicted of killing 9 black parishioners at a Charleston church. Now, that's a rather intense neighbor to have. One can only imagine the conversations or lack thereof between the two. As he transitioned out of solitary confinement, Slager found himself in a low-security environment that housed a mix of inmates, including some high-profile individuals. His status as a former cop made him a target for suspicion and hostility, and he had to navigate the complex social dynamics of prison life. Respect is hard-earned in prison, and Slager had to tread carefully to avoid confrontations while maintaining some semblance of normalcy. Reports suggest that he tried to keep a low profile, focusing on daily routines and possibly engaging in activities that kept him occupied. Even while in prison, Slager's legal battles were far from over, as he sought a reduction in his sentence, claiming his defense was incompetent. However, the court ultimately ruled against him, reinforcing the idea that he would have to serve his time. Slager's time in prison was marked by the constant reminder of his actions. He had gone from wearing a badge to wearing prison stripes, and the reality of his situation likely weighed heavily on him. Reports indicated that he struggled with the consequences of his actions, and he often expressed regret for what had transpired. Derek Chauvin. It all started on May 5, 2020 in Minneapolis, when Derek Chauvin, a 44-year-old white police officer, responded to a call about a suspected counterfeit $20 bill. Now we are not talking about a bank heist or a high-speed chase. But in the hands of Chauvin, this minor incident took a hard left turn, a tragic experience that caused a global outrage and forever changed his life and career. Born in Oakdale, Minnesota, on March 19, 1976, he had a formal education before joining the United States Army Reserve, where he served from 1966 to 2004, including 2 stints in the military police between 1966 and 2000. Chauvin, who was also a 19-year veteran of the Minneapolis Police Department, arrived at the scene with 3 other police officers. They encountered George Floyd, a 46-year-old black man who was sitting in his car with 2 passengers. Instead of the usual arrest procedure, cuff him, stuff him, and call it a day, Chauvin decided to spice it all up. Probably he thought the standard of approach was too boring. As the officers attempted to arrest Floyd, a struggle ensued. Chauvin, who had a history of 18 complaints against him and was involved in 3 police shootings, one of which was fatal, made the fateful decision to kneel on Floyd's neck for nearly 9 minutes, even as Floyd repeatedly pleaded, "I can't breathe." Now, most folks might want to think twice about their actions while they've got an audience, but not Chauvin. No, he committed to the bit like an actor who refuses to break character, even when the cameras are off. Except, of course, the cameras were very much on. The video footage showed a callous disregard for human life, as Chauvin maintained his position even after Floyd lost consciousness. Paramedics arrived on the scene, but it was too late. George Floyd was pronounced dead at a nearby hospital, and the nation was left reeling from the senseless loss of another black life at the hands of law enforcement. The murder of George Floyd sparked a wave of protests across the United States and around the world, with people demanding justice and an end to police brutality and systemic racism. Chauvin was quickly fired from the Minneapolis Police Department, and on May 29, 2020, he was arrested and charged with 3rd-degree murder and 2nd-degree manslaughter. The case was taken over by Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison, who later amended the charges to include unintentional second-degree murder under the felony murder doctrine. Ellison also charged the 3 other officers involved in the incident with aiding and abetting second-degree murder. Chauvin's trial began on March 8, 2021, in the Hennepin County Government Center. It was the first time in Minnesota's history that a judge authorized cameras to show a full criminal trial.
So you're wearing your uniform today?
Correct.
And that would be like your dress uniform or your Class A uniform?
Correct.
The prosecution presented a compelling case, arguing that Chauvin's actions demonstrated a reckless disregard for human life and that he had been trained in the dangers of positional asphyxiation. On April 20th, 2021, after nearly 3 weeks of testimony and 10 hours of deliberation, the jury delivered its verdict. Chauvin was found guilty on all 3 counts: unintentional second-degree murder, third-degree murder, and second-degree manslaughter. It was a historic moment as Chauvin became the first white police officer in Minnesota to be convicted of murdering a black person. Judge Peter Cahill revoked Chauvin's bail and remanded him to the custody of the Hennepin County Sheriff's Office. He was then transferred to the Minnesota Department of Corrections and booked into the Oak Park Heights Maximum Security State Prison, where he was held in solitary confinement. Chauvin spent approximately 23 hours a day in a small, isolated cell, which measured about 10 feet by 10 feet, with white cinder-block walls, a metal toilet and sink, and narrow windows. He was checked on every 30 minutes and with regular mental health evaluations. And the 1 hour he gets out of the cell? That was for exercise alone and could have up to 3 non-contact visits per week. While the conditions were designed to keep him safe, they also meant that he faced intense isolation, a stark contrast to the authority he once held as a police officer. On June 25, 2021, Chauvin was sentenced to 22.5 years in prison, with the possibility of supervised release after serving 2/3 of his sentence. It was a long way to fall for a man who thinks he can do whatever he wants. Chauvin's experience in prison has been marked by isolation and the constant threat of violence. As a former police officer, he is a target for other inmates who view him as a traitor and a symbol of the oppressive system they have fought against. On August 2022, Chauvin was taken to another facility, the FCI Tucson prison, where he was supposed to serve the rest of his jail terms. Here, as soon as he walked into this place, his reception was more like walking into a room where everyone was ready to give a piece of their mind. Inmates formed alliances and cliques based on race, ethnicity, or shared experiences, and Chauvin found himself on the outside, looking in. His notoriety and the high-profile nature of his case made him a target for those seeking to make a name for themselves by attacking a notorious figure. On May 25, 2020, Chauvin faced another harrowing experience when he was stabbed 22 times by a fellow inmate while in the law library of the Federal Correctional Institution in Tucson, Arizona. The inmate, 52-year-old John Turskak, allegedly told investigators that the date of the attack, Black Friday, was chosen to invoke the Black Lives Matter movement. Turskak, who was charged with attempted murder and other related offenses, claimed that he would have killed Chauvin if the corrections officers had not responded quickly. The attack left Chauvin with multiple stab wounds, and he was rushed to a nearby hospital for treatment. While the extent of his injuries was not made public, the incident served as a stark reminder of the dangers Chauvin faces on a daily basis and the ongoing tensions surrounding his case. Despite his conviction and sentence, Chauvin's legal battles are far from over. On June 2022, he pleaded guilty to federal charges of depriving Floyd of his civil rights and was sentenced to an additional 21 years in prison. The plea deal allowed him to avoid a second trial on the federal charges and ensured that he would serve his state and federal sentences concurrently. In August 2022, Chauvin's attorneys filed an appeal, arguing that he did not receive a fair trial due to extensive pretrial publicity and alleged legal errors. The Minnesota Court of Appeals, however, upheld his conviction in April 2023, ruling that Chauvin had received a fair trial and an appropriate sentence. The U.S. Supreme Court later rejected Chauvin's appeal, further solidifying his conviction. As Chauvin continues to serve his sentence, he faces ongoing challenges both in and out of prison. His notoriety and the gravity of his crimes have made him a pariah in the eyes of many, and he will likely face a lifetime of stigma and ostracization. The scars of his actions, both physical and emotional, will undoubtedly linger long after he has served his time. Subscriber's pick. Here is a police officer who believed he was above the law by taking action in his hands. He wielded his badge like a weapon, observing rules and taking justice into his hands. But when the table turned, he found himself behind bars in a place where there was an entirely different form of justice. He was just another inmate, and his past sins were far from forgotten. The very people he once lorded over were now his cellmates, and they weren't about to let him forget it. But will the power he held on the street protect him forever? Let us know your thoughts in the comment section as we unravel the question on how corrupt officers are treated in prison. Gerard Schaefer. In the shadowy corners of Martin County, Florida, a predator lurked behind the badge. Gerard John Schaefer Jr., a sheriff's deputy, was entrusted with the power to protect, but beneath his uniform lay a chilling darkness. While the community slept soundly, he preyed on the vulnerable, luring unsuspecting young women with the very authority he was sworn to uphold. Schaefer's descent into depravity began with a series of sinister encounters. He would stop hitchhikers, often young girls, under the guise of enforcing non-existent laws, only to lead them into a nightmare from which many would never escape. In July 1972, Schaefer stopped two teenage girls, Pamela Sue Wells and Nancy Ellen Trotter, claiming he was enforcing a hitchhiking law. He led them to a remote location where he made sexual advances and threatened them. Fortunately, the girls managed to escape, leading to his arrest for false imprisonment and aggravated assault. He received a light sentence of 1 year in jail and 3 years of probation, a mere slap on the wrist for someone who would go on to commit far worse crimes. While free on bail, astonishingly, those who knew him saw no changes in him, rather he became worse. Schaefer's most notorious crimes occurred in 1973, when he was convicted of the first-degree murders of Susan Place and Georgia Jessup. Both young women were reported missing beneath the charming facade at exactly 8:45 p.m. after last being seen with him. As investigators dug deeper, they uncovered a horrifying pattern of abduction, erotic assault, and murder. Schaefer was not just a murderer. He was a predator who thrived on the vulnerability of his victims. But guess what? The nightmare didn't stop there. More victims emerged. Mary Alice Briscolina and Elsie Lena were found beaten and lifeless, discarded like unwanted dolls. Then came Colette Marie and Barbara Ann Wilcox, who hitchhiked their way into Schaefer's path only to meet a horrifying fate. In January 1977, their skeletal remains were discovered, bound together with baling wire near a large tree. What makes his story even more chilling is the true extent of his crimes remains shrouded in mystery, as many of his victims were never found. With estimates suggesting he may have claimed as many as 30 victims, but justice would come for the sadistic killer as he was sentenced to life imprisonment in 1973. Once behind bars, Schaefer's story took a twisted turn. Rather than reflecting on his actions, he channeled his dark creativity into writing, crafting chilling short stories that echoed his violent past. His prison life was marked by further manipulation and deceit, as he attempted to run a child pornography ring and formed unsettling connections with other notorious criminals. As the walls of his prison cell closed in, one question loomed large. How does a man who once held the power of the law become a mere shadow of his former self, trapped in a cycle of violence and denial? His story took a shocking turn when Schaefer met his own fate in the hands of a fellow inmate on December 3, 1995. Schaefer's reputation as a rat among inmates stemming from his manipulative behavior and past as a law enforcement officer made him a target. Reports indicated that he faced harassment, including being splashed with urine and pelted with feces. His cell was even set on fire twice, indicating a growing animosity towards him from fellow inmates who viewed him as a traitor to the prison code. In the weeks leading up to his death, Schaefer was embroiled in legal troubles, as homicide investigator Tim Bronson had reopened cold cases linked to him, hoping to secure more indictments. Schaefer had expressed intentions to cooperate with authorities regarding the murder of Adam Walsh, a case that had haunted law enforcement for years. This cooperation may have heightened tensions with other inmates who perceived him as a snitch. On the day of his death, Schaefer was found in his cell with his throat slashed and stabbed 42 times around his head and neck. A bloody handprint on the wall was the only clue left behind. Initially, a fellow inmate was suspected of the murder, and Vincent Faustino Rivera was later charged. The motive for the killing was believed to be a quarrel over a cup of hot water, but many speculated that it was more deeply rooted in the prison's culture of violence and retaliation against perceived informants. Schaefer's death prompted various theories. His sister and mother suggested that the murder was linked to his cooperation with detectives investigating the Walsh case, alleging that notorious serial killer Otis Toole might have felt threatened by Schaefer's intentions. Toole had previously confessed to the murder of Adam Walsh, but later recanted. Despite the official narrative, Rivera claimed innocence, stating that the bloody handprint did not match either him or Schaefer. The complexities surrounding Schaefer's death only added to the intrigue of his already notorious life. Drew Peterson. Drew Peterson, a name that became synonymous with scandal and intrigue. Drew Peterson, a former police officer from Bolingbrook, Illinois, who was once a figure that commanded respect and dignity, now finds himself behind bars, grappling with the consequences of his actions. It's indeed a tale that twists and turns, revealing the dark side of a man who seemed to have acquired it all. But first, let's talk about how Drew Peterson became a household name. Peterson was living what seemed like a perfect life: 4 marriages, kids, successful law enforcement career, think of it. But everything took a tragic turn. In 2007, Drew Peterson caught the public's eye when his 4th wife, Stacey Ann Cales Peterson, mysteriously vanished. But the plot thickened when authorities revisited the death of his 3rd wife, Kathleen Savio, whose body had been found in her bathtub back in 2004. Initially ruled an accidental drowning, a second autopsy raised eyebrows and pointed to foul play. Suddenly, the once respected officer was the prime suspect in a murder investigation. Fast forward to 2012, Peterson was convicted of Kathleen's murder, receiving a 38-year sentence. The trial was sensational, with the prosecution using Drew's Law, which allowed hearsay evidence from both Kathleen and Stacey to be introduced. It was a groundbreaking moment in legal history, but for Peterson, it was the beginning of a nightmare. When Peterson entered the Illinois Department of Corrections, he quickly learned that prison life was far from what he had experienced as a cop. Initially housed at Menard Correctional Center, he found himself in a precarious position. Imagine being a former police officer in a place where trust is scarce and your past makes you a target. Within weeks, Peterson was attacked by another inmate who saw an opportunity to profit by selling Peterson's belongings on eBay. Talk about a harsh welcome. It was a stark reminder that respect is earned in prison, and being a former cop didn't afford him any special treatment. In fact, it often did the opposite. Things took another dramatic turn in 2015 when Peterson was charged with soliciting the murder of James Glasgow, the state's attorney who had prosecuted him. Can you believe it? Here was a man already serving time for murder, and he was plotting another crime from behind bars. This scheme was uncovered when fellow inmate Antonio Beast Smith wore a wire for investigators, capturing Peterson's chilling conversations about wanting Glasgow dead. In 2016, Peterson was convicted of solicitation of murder, adding another 40 years to his already lengthy sentence. This incident only deepened the divide between him and the other inmates. Many viewed him as cowardly, someone who couldn't own up to his actions and instead sought to manipulate the situation further. Life in prison for Peterson was fraught with tension and hostility. Inmates generally have little sympathy for former police officers, viewing them as betrayers of the inmate code. Peterson's attempts to fit in were met with skepticism. He was often regarded as an outsider, and his reputation as a cop made it difficult for him to find allies. Imagine the psychological toll this must have taken on him. He was surrounded by individuals convicted of serious crimes, but instead of finding a friendly relationship, he faced suspicion and contempt. In interviews, Peterson maintained his innocence, claiming he was unfairly targeted. This denial may have been his way of coping with the harsh realities of prison life. On February 22, 2023, Peterson was found dead in his prison cell at the Illinois Department of Corrections. The circumstances surrounding his death were shrouded in mystery, but many speculated that it was a result of the animosity he had faced throughout his incarceration. Reports indicated that Peterson had been the target of harassment and threats from other inmates, who were not shy about expressing their contempt for him. While the official cause of death was initially unclear, it was widely believed that his violent end was a culmination of the hostility he faced from fellow inmates. Peterson had become a pariah, not just for his crimes, but for the fact that he had once been a figure of authority. Many inmates saw him as a symbol of betrayal, and the prison culture often punishes those who were once in power. The news of Peterson's death sent shockwaves through the media and the public. Many wondered if it was a violent end that he had long anticipated, given the threats he faced from fellow inmates. His life had become a cautionary tale about the consequences of abusing power and the brutal reality of prison life for former law enforcement officers. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.